Chapter 4 of Tractate Shabbos discusses the laws of insulating food on Shabbos. Obviously, it's subject to quite a lot of discussion, but broadly, before Shabbos starts, you may insulate food as long as it won't get hotter than it is now, and you can't insulate food at all on Shabbos itself. Okay, first Mishnah. Before Shabbos, if you want to insulate food, you may not use mark, manure, salt, lime, or sand if they're wet or dry, as they all increase heat. Straw, grape skins, flocking, and grasses cannot be used when moist, but they may be used when dry. The Gemara asks, this mark, which is essentially pulp mass, does it refer to just olive pulp or also sesame pulp? Elsewhere, in a similar case, by placing an insulation box on top of mark, it only mentions olive mark, so that would imply not sesame. Well, no, that's a unique case, as only olive mark radiates heat upwards. As for insulation, even sesame works. There's a story brought where a sage's servant placed a cup of water over a kettle, and the sage told him off. This is different from the case of a kettle on a kettle, as that's just preserving heat, unlike the cup, which is increasing its heat. Another story, a servant spread a turban over a jug and placed a ladle on it, so the sage told him off. The reason why was because later, as the turban is a cloth that's cared about, the servant ended up wringing the cloth out, which is not allowed on Shabbos. The use of flocking is actually muktzah on Shabbos, even though you might have thought otherwise, as it could technically have a use on Shabbos of reclining on it. You can, however, return flocking stuffing to an old pillow on Shabbos. Some hold you can't open the neck opening of a garment for the first time on Shabbos, and that makes you liable. This would be different from a barrel lid, which is an actual separate piece from the barrel. There's a discussion in this regard between clothes that were loosely stitched together by a launderer, which are considered one entity even after the washing, which is because you're fine with the stitches, as it makes rewashing easier, as opposed to an axe, which the head and handle are considered separate entities after it's done being used, as people would reuse the stick for other purposes. There are similar conversations regarding compartments in an oven. In regards to laws of impurity, there are similar rules by the axe, that is considered two entities after usage, now by laws of impurity, by scissors, which have two parts, and a carpenter's plane also. However, we still rule strictly by these with laws of impurity, even when they're not being used, so you don't make mistakes. Okay, by the Mishnah, it said that there were certain things you cannot use to insulate when they're moist. We try to figure out if this means that they became moist on their own or even from an outside source. Well, one of them was flocking, and elsewhere it mentions clothing too, but those actually can get moist from an internal source, being from sweat of the animal it was harvested from, so that remains an unresolved point. Okay, new Mishnah. You may insulate with clothing, produce, dove feathers, sawdust, and fine flax combings. Rabbi Yehuda only allows with coarse flax combings, which is explained later. The Gemara states a pretty famous story in relation to the concept of dove feathers. It states that Elisha Baal Kenafim, the winged one, instituted that you should maintain a clean body while wearing tefillin, either not passing wind or not sleeping. So why was he called the winged one? At some point during this time period, the Roman government established a law that anyone wearing tefillin would have their brain gouged out. So Elisha was walking around wearing tefillin in defiance, so an officer saw him and chased him into an alley. Elisha took the tefillin off and was holding them in his hands, so the officer asked him what he was holding, and he said, dove's wings, and when he opened them, there were miraculously dove wings instead of tefillin. Specifically, a dove, as the Jewish people are compared to a dove, as their wings protect them, and the commandments protect us. New Mishnah. You can insulate food with animal hide for Shabbos, and they're not considered muktzah, so you can move them. You can also use wool shearing, but that is muktzah and can't be moved, as you'd have to just remove the lid and let the shearings fall off themselves. Then, to get the food out, some say you have to tilt the pot and pour the food out and not remove the pot in case you're not able to replace it. Others say you can remove and replace it. There is some debate in the Gemara if this is discussing hides used by a common person, who is more likely that he'll use the hides for stuff and therefore they're not muktzah on Shabbos, or if we're discussing hides of a craftsman who wouldn't use them, thus making them muktzah on Shabbos. There are suggestions back and forth, but it's an unresolved dispute. Okay, touching on a topic in a later chapter, and one of the main topics in all of the laws of Shabbos, there are 39 forms of work on Shabbos, which are not allowed. The list and discussions will be in chapter 7, but for now, what do the 39 correspond to? Some say to the 39 forms of labor done in the construction of the tabernacle. Some say to the 39 times the word work or its variations are used in the Torah. The second answer has some debate because there are sometimes the word work is used, but it's not counted as it's not referring to actual work, so it may not exactly be 39. It also mentions in the list of labors of the assembly of the tabernacle, transferring from wagon to wagon, which teaches no transferring from private domain to private domain through a public domain. In regards to the point about wool shearing being muktzah, some teach that they're actually not considered to be muktzah if they're being used for insulation, meaning they're muktzah in general if not being used. Specifically if they're permanently designated for insulating. That makes them not muktzah. Clearly, the Mishnah is discussing wool for insulation to some extent. This obviously is subject to lots of dispute, with proofs going either way. There's a similar argument about bringing a basket of earth into your house. Some saying it's required to have a designated corner, or else it's muktzah. The logic by earth is unique, however, as there's nothing you can really do to earth to make it more designated for use. You can just intend to use it as your designation, which is sufficient there. This gets into a further point about polishing silver. And there's a point that polishing substances can be used to wash your face on Shabbos, which could be a problem of removing facial hair, but that source that says it's allowed is explained to be speaking about a minor, or a woman, or a eunuch. It also gives a list of things you can wash your face with on Shabbos that don't have a concern of removing hair: powdered brick, sesame pulp, crushed pepper, and an aloe plant mixture of some sort. A quick side point, there's a discussion about if you can bruise olives to sweeten them on Shabbos. Some say no, as it's considered wasting food when you do this to an olive. There's a bit more on washing your face. The dispute in the Mishnah, if you can remove the pot or not, is basically that everybody agrees that if the wool slot collapses, you can't put the pot back. So the argument is if we're concerned about the wool slot collapsing. Some somewhat random points on muktzah. There was a fragrant plant that was routinely pulled out of the ground to be smelled. So if you pulled it out and replaced it before Shabbos, it's not muktzah to do again on Shabbos. Elsewise, you can't. There's a similar rule by a knife stuck into some bricks for safekeeping. Both of those points are refuted, that you can remove them, even if you didn't do it from before Shabbos, from a similar case in regards to pulling turnips from the ground, which is permitted. New Mishnah. You may not insulate food after Shabbos starts. If you did insulate before Shabbos and it gets uncovered, you can recover it on Shabbos. You can also fill a bottle with cold water and put it under a cushion on Shabbos. The Gemara states an opinion that in addition to cold water, you can insulate any food to be cold on Shabbos. A different opinion says the opposite, that it's not allowed, but they conceded to the lenient opinion as it was said by an older sage out of respect. Some particular individuals did act stricter. A few other miscellaneous points are mentioned about insulation, some of which were already said, like a kettle on top of a kettle. And a final rule, no crushing snow or hail on Shabbos to collect the water, but you may use snow or hail to place into some liquid in order to cool it. And with that, that's the end of chapter 4.